I'd like to welcome Dr. Molefe, who's going to be speaking on an African ethics of personhood and bioethics, a reflection on abortion and euthanasia. So just a little bit about Dr. Molefe is that he is a senior researcher at CLEAR, which is the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa at the University of Fort Hare. His research focuses on African ethics, bioethics, development studies, environmental ethics, and social and political philosophy. He is the author of numerous works, including an African philosophy of personhood, morality, and politics. Just a bit about the book that he's going to be touching on a little bit, I hope in the next couple of minutes. This book explores the salient ethical idea of personhood in African philosophy. It is a philosophical exposition that pursues the ethical and political consequences of the normative idea of personhood as a robust or even foundational ethical category. Personhood refers to the moral achievements of the moral agent, usually captured in terms of a virtuous character, which have consequences for both morality and politics. The aim is not to argue for the plausibility of the ethical and political consequences of the idea of personhood. Rather, the book showcases some of the moral political content and consequences of the account it presents. You can go ahead, Dr. Molefe, for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers, the department, and Shuma for having me here, and also to share some of the results of research. The work I'm going to share with you, I started working on it around 2020, and yeah, it's just a few ideas that I thought are worth exploring and really thinking about and exchanging ideas. So I work in the tradition of African philosophy, specifically in the area of ethics. Important debates have taken place in Western moral philosophy on several fronts. And many of these debates have not occurred in the African context, at least in philosophy. So when I started thinking specifically about these two cases, the case of abortion, the question of abortion, the debate of abortion, and the debate on euthanasia, is because there has not been extensive work, at least among African philosophers, reflecting on the consequences of the ideas on these questions. So the purpose really of this work was to take one salient concept, it's not the only one, might be others, one salient concept, and specifically the idea of personhood or umuntu among the Ngunis, the idea of personhood as an ethical category, and evaluate its content, and after, in fact, do an exposition, a philosophical exposition of its content, and then think about the consequences of that content for these two categories, the questions of abortion and the question of euthanasia. And also to properly locate this discussion. This is a discussion in an area in moral philosophy called bioethics, where our biological existence occasions certain ethical questions, occasions certain questions of values. So in this particular book, I deal with questions at two categories in relation to our biological existence. Questions at the beginning of life, right? Questions around pregnancy, right? Not so much the pregnant, but that which is possessed in pregnancy, right? And those are questions at the beginning of life, right? There are a lot of questions that philosophers deal with there. Questions like stem cell research. But one of the questions that has really captured my attention is a question of the category I call the young, and specifically here, from a zygote, from the prenatal stage of pregnancy to the end. If you think of that thing that emerges at that time after fertilization, if you think of that thing that is encapsulated during the period of pregnancy, right, from when a zygote is formed until birth, just before you cut that, and you want to think this thing that is carried during this time and through its evolution, when does it become of ethical significance, such that it is not permissible to do certain things to it? Or do ethical questions arise at all for this thing during that period? That's what the debate really is about. That's what the debate is really about. And in this way, then we're asking questions about, does this thing that is carried, however you may classify it, you know, is it a thing of value? Right? Is it throughout, or it's not a thing of value throughout, or it's a thing of value at particular periods? So that's the question. The standard Western view that I was encountering in the literature in abortion, well, so on the one hand, you find people like Warren say, throughout the entire period of pregnancy, this thing that is carried, it has no value at all, and therefore abortion is permissible. Right? On the other hand, you find views that says, from the second trimester, the fetus has developed to a point where it carries moral value, it makes moral claims on us. From that period on, it is impermissible to terminate, but you can terminate before then, right? So the question then is around, when is abortion permissible, and if it is, when is it permissible? Or on the other hand, there are those say it's not permissible at all. Those on the other hand argue that throughout the entire period it is permissible. Right? And the key question then is, how do you determine permissibility? How do you determine impermissibility? Right? So philosophers, to deal with that question, they use a methodology of what they call moral status. So moral status is a term used to indicate things towards which we have value, things towards which we have obligations, or things that we have obligations to, right? Obligations to respect them, or obligations not to harm them, and of obligations also to benefit them. So there's that concept that we use. And the key question then, if you state it in philosophical terms, is, if you limit it to a fetus, for argument's sake, does a fetus have moral status? Or at what stage during pregnancy is the thing that is carried through a woman's body? When is it of value, if at all? That's what the question is. That's what the question is. On the other hand, there's a question that has to do, this is the beginning of life, right? On the other hand, there's a question towards the end of life, right? Towards the end of life. When you're old and frail and you're medically sick, and you're old and frail and you're very sick and you live in excruciating pain, and there is no potential for relief. There's no potential for relief. The only thing that we are sure of is that your life will continue to deteriorate and until you die. At that particular point, the question that arises, does a person have a choice? Does a person have a choice to decide when to end their life? Should that be a moral question that we should consider, right? So typically this is done in a medical context where a person is in very extreme medical conditions where there's no hope, right? So, and then euthanasia, literally translated, mercy killing, right? So this is killing, this is a person, this is the medical practitioner, terminating someone's life for their own benefit, to relieve them from the suffering, right? And so this is, and this is very critical. It's killing them for their own benefit, and in relation to the medical condition, which is extreme, excruciating, as no technology or no medical relief is possible, right? And when all things being equal and we are sure about the science, then we deal with the moral question. Would it be permissible to do euthanasia? And even in this case, you find two diverging views. On the one hand, you find the view that says, this is typically the Catholic view, that says human life is sacred, under no circumstance is permissible to terminate human life. Right? Other views say, look, some views says no. If you take a standard view that values autonomy as the most important thing about it, say, look, if you make a rational decision and we've got the medical evidence that this is the case, there's not going to be improvement and your life is just a life of shame, deterioration, you're just going to be suffering, you have a choice to make that voluntary decision to say, please take me out, right? And the considerations intuitively is about how to deal with human suffering at that particular stage of our lives, right? Is there a place for mercy? Is there a place for mercy, right? And the tension then for those who of religious bent is say, no, we've got no license, legitimate space to make a contribution. Only the divine can do that. So we can't license ourselves like that. But those of a more secular orientation says, look, intuitively morality would seem that we need to be merciful, right? So this has really been the debate, right? But for the scope of my discussion is then within ethics, it's not within law, right? Jurisprudence and lawyers could come with determination that stipulate, but I want to think, do we have good reasons that we could draw from ethical resources to really reflect on these questions? So on my part, because there's not been much literature in African philosophy thinking about these questions, I wanted to do an examination of this concept of personhood, to say, what would this concept, what would be the consequences of this concept? And I must also make this admission. What I was not doing was I was not evaluating this concept as to whether it is correct or not. But what I wanted to do is to say, look, let's subject it to philosophical scrutiny and see what it can give out, right? And then from there, we can come back to do the latter project of saying, is this a plausible view or not, right? So that's what this project is about. Take a concept, and the motivation for that kind of project is that often than not, many of the important things that affect us in the world, we tend to think them using Western lenses or lenses from the global north. But for me, it was important to start thinking about these problems from the global south, specifically an African perspective, and specifically the concept of Ubuntu, or as I put it in my work, the idea of the ethics of personhood. So let's get to this idea of personhood and see what it would imply about the two cases. So I'm going to be rough, I'm going to be sketchy just to give you a picture, and then we can engage. Right, so before we go to either of the cases, let's start with this concept of personhood. So the way I understand this concept of personhood, I understand it in two ways. The concept of personhood really is about moral recognition. At the heart of this concept of personhood is about moral recognition. Right? It's about moral recognition. But there are two kinds of recognitions that I play here. On the one hand, there is what I want to think of as a much more fundamental form of recognition. Right? Another one, what I would tend to think of is the recognition that flows from the primary one, the secondary recognition. So the first kind of recognition is where we recognize you for being the kind of a thing that you are. And after recognizing you for the kind of a thing that you are, we then associate value with you for being that kind of a thing. That's the first kind. What we might call, and this kind of recognition is the one that grounds the fundamental kind of respect, right? Let me give you an example of this kind of recognition. And it's recognition of the value of a thing, which comes from the kind of a thing that it is. If, for example, you meet a lot of buildings, you're walking around and you see a lot of buildings. And as you walk around, somebody says, stop, this building that you are passing, that you're about to enter is Parliament, right? It is Parliament. So please be careful about decorum, be careful about how you behave, right? So when they stop you in that way, there's a call for you to recognize that this building is distinct, legally and politically in the country from any other building. It's distinct from your house, it's distinct, ontologically occupies a status. And when we're aware of the status, there's a particular way that we must relate to that particular building, right? Another way to think about this is very controversial. A lot of you might not like a particular president. You might not like a particular president, right? You might not like this president because of how he conducts himself, but when you relate with him on the mere fact that he's a president, there's a particular kind of respect that you must give him. So here what you're recognizing is the state ontology, it's the status of the office that he occupies that grants him some kind of requirement that you respect them, which is different when you have to think about another kind of respect, what kind of a president they are. So on the one hand, you recognize the office they occupy and the status that it grants them. On the other hand, you could evaluate their performance as a president. And those are two distinct things, right? So the one kind of recognition, it's fundamental, right? That is fundamental, right? And then it explains the other one, right? Then we can, when we recognize that you're a president, then there's another question we could ask you. Could we still respect you for the kind of a president that you are? On the one instance, we recognize you for the status merely of being president. The day you are inaugurated as a president, there's a particular kind of respect that is due to you merely for being a president. There are certain entitlements that come to you merely for being a president. But there's another question also that comes with, how have you conducted yourself as a president? Then we may respect you in the one form and not respect you on another. Do we get that distinction? So there's that distinction that's going on in the idea of personhood. So in other words, this idea of personhood has got those two dimensions. The first one is the primary, the second one is the secondary. The primary one is what we tend to think of in terms of human dignity. Right. So if we're hunting, we do game hunting, we're carrying guns. I'm not saying it's permissible, I'm not saying I support it, I'm just making a point. And as you're about to shoot, someone say, hey, be careful, that's a person, referring to a human being. We would be surprised if we do insist wanting to kill, right? Would have made a claim that brings your attention a particular ontological being which has got a particular status, and that status determines how you should relate to it. This being has not done anything, it's just, you've just recognized it for what it is. Right? So it's that kind of respect that would affect how you as a hunter you would behave, right? And when you've recognized that, it affects how you behave, right? So another thing, whether he's a criminal or a bad person and all of that. So there's that idea of value. It is this idea of value that tends to do a lot of work when you think about how to relate with things, right? In other words, the question we'll be asking, when we encounter a fetus, does the fetus make that kind of moral demand on us that we should stop before we behave towards it, or it does not? And then before we can decide that a fetus does that, we need to ask, what is it about human beings that makes them to make this kind of demand? I hope that is clear, right? So there's that aspect of the concept of personhood about the deeper form of recognition. There's the other side of the secondary form of recognition. The secondary form of recognition focuses on how you, as the kind of a thing you are, you've conducted yourself. How have you as a human being conducted yourself? So much that if your conduct has been one that is not befitting of a human being, we could say this is not a person. Right? We're not denying the first form of recognition. We're saying you have not lived up to the possibilities of this. In other words, you've lived below your capabilities, right? Not that you're not a human being. You're still a human being, but you've lived below that. And then in that form, we can berate you, not as a human being, but in terms of the quality of your conduct or the quality of your character. So you've got these two things together that constitute what I think is the theory of personhood. On the one hand, recognition that you are this kind of a thing with these kinds of possibilities, right? When you actualize these possibilities, then you say, hey, you are a person, right? So what are these possibilities? So the belief seems to be in African thought that a human being comes loaded with the capacity or the possibility for virtue, right? That you could develop a good character. And this good character is one that is described in terms of relational virtues. You're kind, generous, loving, forgiving, magnanimous, compassionate, right? Things to tolerant and all of that, right? So when we say you're a person, we're really saying that you manifest these virtues. You've got a character like that, right? So this concept of personhood then has got those two dimensions. On the one hand is the recognition that you are valued because you have this capacity. Right, the capacity for virtue. On the other hand is to say, look, you have developed this capacity and now you've achieved personhood. Right? For a discussion of abortion and euthanasia, the important part of personhood is these capacities. The question that we should ask is, does a fetus possess these capacities? Does the fetus possess these capacities? Maybe to make the point even clearer, you could ask, do animals possess this capacity? If an animal doesn't possess this capacity, then it does not make any moral demands on us. Then we do not owe it any duties, right? So in that sense, we can do with an animal as we please, right? But now the focus is a specific candidate. The focus here is the candidate called a fetus. The question, does the fetus have the capacities for virtue, right? Does have capacities for virtue. And so my analysis of African thought seems to suggest, look, the fetus does not have the capacity for virtue. Does not have the capacity for virtue. But as much as it doesn't have the capacity for virtue, it's if you put a fetus here and you put a donkey, for example, there's a difference between them. Though both of them do not have, at least to a reasonable threshold, capacity for ultimately developing virtue, it seems that there's an important difference between them. That one seems to have a potential for this capacity, while the other don't have the potential. If the most important thing in this theory is that ultimately, how we will measure your life is in terms of you being able to pursue virtue, having a potential seems to make all the moral difference. So in that light, a fetus in this particular view is very important. It's morally significant, and its significance is that the most important thing in this thought that one day you should be able to pursue or Ubuntu. If a fetus, unlike a donkey, unless a piece of paper or a brick, does have a potential that this does not have, it seems that that should count for something, right? And merely because that should count for something, it seems that a fetus on this particular view makes some kind of demands on us. And this is important also if you think about what is important in this theory. The moral constraints generated by this virtue-centric theory is that if the most important thing that we must care about, that ultimately we want to put you on a stand and want to ask ourselves as a community, have you lived what it means to be human? Anything that has got a potential for that should matter. Right? I'm not saying it should matter to the same degree as those that actually have the capacity, but it must matter to some degree. On that basis, this particular view seems to imply that a fetus has got a partial moral status. It's partial because it doesn't have the actual capacity, but it has the potential for it, right? So there's a difference between the two. In other words, if you're in a trade-off situation where you have to choose between a fetus and someone who actually has an actual capacity, you actually have to choose the one with the capacity because they count more, because they're much more closer to the project of virtue than the one with the potential. Right? So that's how you'd resolve that. So just roughly, on this particular view, the thing that is contained merely because it possesses the potential for that which is the most important moral consideration in the world, it has moral status, unlike things that don't have that kind of potential or capacity. Right. So on this particular view, if you take this idea that the most important thing about us is participating in relations of excellence, anything that has got a capacity for that, capacity or potential for excellence has got value. We must consider it when we make decisions that will affect its future. For that reason, this kind of idea seems to entail that we've got duties towards a fetus, and therefore abortion would be generally impermissible. So that, I think, is a consequence of this philosophical idea. Let's turn to the question of euthanasia quickly. Another thing that's interesting about this view is that at the height of what is expected of humanity is that you must live a life that is exuding with excellence. The life that's exuding with excellence is that life where if you think of it negatively, is where your life generally is not characterized by shame. Not characterized by shame, right? And this shame, and specifically by shame here, it's what I could think of as biological shame, because it's opposed to the kinds of excellence we associate with the person, right? So the longer you live, you're expected to your body to be decorated by this excellence, right? In other words, you're supposed to have this good character, and this good character becomes the jewel of that really makes you to stand out as a human being, which is really your goal, right? At old age, this theory seems to say one writer, Godfrey Tangwa, by African bioethics, he makes a very important, one of the things that Africans fear the most is that suffering and shame associated with old age, right? And the intuition is that that kind of debilitation that comes with old age tends to be opposed to the excellencies that one would have acquired over time. And this debilitation would tend then to cast a dark cloud, or to remove that status that one would have achieved by accumulation of personhood, right? And for the sake of preserving this, what you might think of this what a person would have worked hard for, this status of dignity. And the notion of dignity, I'm using it as dignity in a performative sense, where you were able to amass the dignity associated with your performances, right? So considerations of why euthanasia, this idea might permit euthanasia, come from the fact that anything that might mar or might associate your life with shame due to old age or to disease may be contrary to consideration of the excellences associated with personhood, to preserve your personhood, right? Or its memory or its importance, right? This theory permits euthanasia precisely because at that particular age, you've reached a state physically and medically where you can no longer pursue a personhood or excellence, but you are in a stage where that personhood itself could be undermined by the shame associated with this extreme medical condition. So the idea of the potential to pursue this excellence, or where you no longer have that potential, becomes a deciding factor at the end of life spectrum, right? Here we protect you because we've got the potential to grow. Here we could terminate you. Here you could volunteer to terminate your life because you've reached a point where you can no longer exercise that potential. And all that you've acquired could be brought to shame through suffering and disease. To preserve this personhood that you've achieved, and we're sure that there's no medical intervention that can assist you, the loss of that potential to participate in personhood is sufficient ground, ethically speaking, to permit a euthanasia. So you can see the explanation stems from this concept. So what's the most important thing about human existence? Is this potential, is this capacity you have for virtue? What's the goal of human existence? Is to pursue Ubuntu, right? To be more of a human being, to be better at this thing, being a human being, to perfect yourself. That's the goal, right? So why must we allow you, why must we forbid abortion? Because it stops those things with an opportunity to participate from participating, being against this requirement of this of excellence. On the other hand, on the end of life, when you've reached the height of existence, but you can no longer exercise this potential or capacity at that particular point to preserve the status, then you may permit euthanasia. So the difficult question then that could come on the one hand is then the case of you, if you never develop anything good, right? You've just been a wretched humanity. What do we do with you, right? But the principle, the underlying principle is the question that we have to ask when we deal with cases like that, do you still have the potential to do it? If you have the potential, then we should give you more chance to continue. If you don't, then euthanasia is permissible. I think I want to leave it at that to allow for engagement.
Thank you, Dr. Molefe. Yeah, so I'm just gonna field questions and then maybe add some of my own, starting with Tom.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
At least I can hear you.
Yeah.
The ones online, they hear.
I can hear.
Okay.
Okay, cool. I'll speak up. So, yeah, I'm sympathetic to your comments about the beginning of the one question would be, how potentiality identify? and intentionality of identifying the virtue. Now, some people would say that potentiality is insufficient for a person. I want to get clear about whether you think it's sufficient to confer a person. Wasn't quite clear on that. But you see, the follow-up question would be, those people who think it's insufficient would say, therefore abortion is permissible, because you don't have a person. And we have something that might develop these these virtues later on, but that's really beside the point. We don't have a person. So that's my question about abortion. The question about euthanasia would be this waiving of the powers in old age. We can grant that, but if you grant that the virtues of what matter in abortion, as it were, the teleology of virtue, then surely the person still has that. In fact, they don't just have it, they actualize it when they're old as well. I'm not quite sure that they're lacking in virtue. They might be lacking in certain physical factors. They might, but surely they can educate their children, they can have wisdom of various kinds. Seems to me sort of captious or tendentious to focus on their way in physical factors.
Do I go? Okay. Yeah. Look, thank you. Thanks, Tom, for that. Look, the first question. Surely you're aware of the distinction that the concept personhood is in philosophy, moral philosophy. It's a technical term, you know. So when we say it's usually reserved for full moral status, right? And my comment, I don't quite grant a fetus a personhood, right? I granted partial moral status because personhood for me is a function of the capacity, the actual capacity. But a fetus merely has the potential. And because it has made as a potential, it's not quite a person, doesn't have human dignity, but it has moral status. So I take the idea to admit of degrees. So in other words, so if you take a normal human being and a fetus, the major difference between the two, that one occupies the zone of the potential and one occupies the zone of the actual, right? But maybe what might be unintuitive about this idea is that it implies that even a zygote, insofar as it occupies the zone of the potential, has got partial moral status. Maybe the question might be, could we draw a distinction between second trimester, fetus and the zygote? Would we want to say which does the degree of the potential matter and all of that? And I think the more decent thing to say, that as long as it is settled, the sufficient condition is, will you be able in the near future to participate in excellence? If that is settled, then you've got partial moral status. So the question of degrees is not important. I'm not sure that's intuitive. I'm not sure that's appealing, but the consequence is that abortion is impermissible throughout pregnancy. As soon as you're conceived, as soon as there's conception. So I'm not sure that's appealing, but at least this view, if what is important is excellence in that sense, it implies that.
But I also think there are people, perhaps the majority of these days, who deny that that's sufficient to grant moral status.
Okay.
So people say, yes, there is this long-term teleology, but that's insufficient to confirm moral status on fetus. I mean, I think they're wrong, but that's what they said.
Yeah. Well, I say, I think it's sufficient. I think, yeah. So, but maybe the second question as well. Maybe to the second question. I don't think for me it's just about the winning of. For me, I don't think it's just the winning of powers. And
all right. Okay. Yes. Just before you answer, Dr. Molefe, can you also take a question from Fatima, and then he'll answer them both at the same time.
Okay, I'm somewhat covered by Asanda. My question is similar. Primarily, my concern is the way in which we speak about the fetus without the body that holds the fetus, as though it is viable in and of itself. I mean, we wouldn't speak similarly about a hand or a foot or a heart or a liver. We wouldn't give it a assigned moral status. We would inevitably connect it to the body that it is within, because it can't function on its own. And then exactly, a similar concern about how you would envision the status of the individual who would be subject to a potentially to a state where they could no longer grow their own personhood, as we speak about the person at the end of life who would be considering euthanasia. So the person the body who would hold the body of the fetus, if they could no longer continue their own personhood by virtue of not being able to have an abortion, how would we think about them at this stage of life? So it's about transferring the same idea of dignity and the possibility of a good life, so to speak, to the person who holds the fetus. And then to contemplate how we think about the fetus without the body that holds the fetus, as though it can possibly even exist without the body that holds the fetus. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Virtue of that they have some degree of moral status. And of course, they don't have that potentiality independent of external inputs, because in order to develop into something with the capacity for personhood, they need all the kind of nutritional inputs and all of what happens when a fetus grows in the womb. Now, you mentioned that might go all the way back to the zygote, but my question is, doesn't it go all the way back to the gamete? Because it's also true that the sperm or an egg has the potential to develop into something with the capacity for personhood, not independent of external inputs, but still it has that potential. So what does the view which you're describing say about practices like contraception, which involve storing gametes?
People online and if you have questions,
Yeah, I think
you can summarize your question.
I don't want to summarize this question must be repeated. I think it's an important question. Yes. It's an important question. I think it must be repeated.
Okay.
The mic is
Shall I repeat it? Yeah, please. So
Can you hear?
all right.
There's an echo.
okay.
Is that okay now?
Yes.
So my question is about the potentiality, because the fetus doesn't have the capacity for personhood, but it has the potentiality or the potential for the capacity for personhood, and that's not independent of external inputs, because it needs all of the nutrition and help to become a child. But is that not also true and equally true of a gamete, such as a sperm or an egg, because that has the potential to develop into something with the capacity for personhood, not independent of external inputs, but nonetheless. So what does the view which you're describing say about practices of contraception which involve destroying gametes, such as using spermicidal gel?
You're quite honest. To be honest, thanks, George, for that important question. Look, to be quite honest, I didn't think about the implications of my view, particularly of potentiality in that extent. But what occurs to my mind is that maybe my view might want to further draw a distinction between potentialities that morally matter and potentialities that don't morally matter. Because the kind of external support that is required for a zygote and the kind of external support that's required for the gametes, as you say, I think there's a difference there. I think there's a distinction there that one could carry. That one has got a potential. One has got a potential to enter into an evolutionary process where they can participate in the project of excellence. But one is outside of that particular evolutionary process. And I think metaphysically that difference makes all the difference. But I'm not sure I've not thought about it in terms of what that would imply for if contraceptives, but I'm thinking metaphysically, one could draw that distinction, that it makes all the moral difference whether you've entered into that evolutionary process. And then post-conception, you've entered into that evolutionary process. So I think that metaphysical difference should have serious bearing. But I don't want to follow it through to think about what would it imply for contraception or not. So in other words, but also look, if you think about even how I frame this theory, it seems that for me, I think those who have entered into that evolutionary process that will lead to the capacity being developed, I think those for me is obvious that they've got partial moral status, but also because they've entered, then we've got a duty to do that. But for me, remember that I don't require. My theory it does not require that we maximize perfection. It does not require that. It does not require that everything that has got a potential to do so, particularly those that are outside of the revolutionary process, that we should include them. So if you take this as a satisfying view, then it could entail that but I don't want to commit myself. I need to think much more carefully about it. But I think there's a metaphysical distinction which has got moral consequences that we could draw, whether you are in the evolutionary process or not. I'm not sure if that goes a long way, but I think at the very least, if we can recognize that, I think theoretically can allow me to say, look, we've got duties to these, we don't have duties to these kinds of things with this potential.
Thank you so much. I think I want to also give space for the critical, I guess, engagement that we're seeing in the.
Look, I'm not even seeing.
Yes.
Yes. I wish I could read.
Yes, sorry. I'll read it for you, and then maybe you can make a comment to any of the concerns that are being brought up. One of the concerns that we're seeing are from Asanda Benya, who asks, why is the idea of excellence? Why is this idea of excellence, and what is this idea of excellence rather? And why is it being allowed to trample on the project of subjecthood or the woman's autonomy? So that's one of the concerns.
Maybe let's deal with them one by one.
No, I think it's better for us to deal with them maybe as they come so that we can end on time. There's going to be about 10 minutes, like about 5 minutes left. So I just want to also give them a platform.
If you can just hit the first one. Okay,
yes. So what is this idea of excellence, and why is it being allowed to trample on the project of subjecthood or the woman's autonomy? And then from Bernard Weiss, there's also an issue that you're not obviously drawing the right conclusion from observing that the embryo is merely a potential person, given that the mother is an actual person. So the idea that the potentiality of the embryo is very much already contingent on the actuality of the mother, and that obviously has consequences for whether, I guess, abortion would probably be permissible on those grounds. So I mean, there are a number of other comments. Maybe I'll read the last one because I think Samantha Richmond, who says, thank you, Dr. Molefe, for sharing these thought-provoking theoretical philosophical postulations. Where do you think the scope lies to bridge these theoretical constructs with legal jurisprudence when it comes to abortion and euthanasia? So I know that there are many other questions. I'll probably save them for you so that you can read them, but perhaps you can respond to these considerations.
Yeah, so the first one, I think in relation to why is excellence used to trample on the autonomy of women? I think I've responded to that. And I've responded to it by saying, let's rethink what concept of autonomy are we using. If you're using the liberal concept of autonomy, autonomy means independence, then that's another. And I'm saying that the idea I'm using of autonomy is the one that is typical in feminist and in African thought, where autonomy is understood metaphysically as something relational. And I'm saying, why is this relationship not in, so even that conception gives you a different conception of subjecthood, right? Subjecthood is not the Cartesian sense where I'm just stuck alone in my head, but it's the idea that I understand my subjecthood as something as in terms of interdependence. But the implications of my view, which might even maybe burdensome to some people, is that it requires us also to include a fetus in those kinds of relationships as part of what it means to be involved in thinking about our personhood. If it is true that a fetus has got moral status, then when we imagine our personhood, we must also include it in those kinds of relationships. So I don't think it's a trampling of autonomy. I think it offers a different way to think about autonomy. Let's not think of autonomy in liberal terms. You could think of autonomy in communitarian or in feminist terms, where autonomy is understood in relational terms. And in that way, those relationships can be extensive, right, to include even a fetus. Yeah, and there was a comment by Vice about, I didn't understand.
Fact that the potentiality of the fetus is very much already contingent on something that's actual, right? Which is the person who's carrying the pregnancy, right? So it seems like that would already, I think I guess the need of the theory that you present to try and kind of create almost like a distinction between the two entities that are in question becomes a bit murkier when you see that the existence of the one is very much contingent on the already existing other. Yeah.
I'm not sure I follow the thought. I'm not sure that I follow the thought. I'm not sure I follow the thought. I think obviously biologically one depends on the other. But I'm not sure that I cannot metaphysically ask the question about, does this thing count in its own right? I'm not sure. That's why I'm saying if somebody can tell me what they read in that dependency, that would be very interesting. I'm not, yeah.
Yeah, because the question is that there is, I mean, I'm not to use the term, thing, but that already the person who's carrying what you call a thing.
I'm using the thing here with inverted commas, yes.
Exactly. So this is already a person, you know, and like Bernard is arguing that the other one is just a potential. And I think the question that everyone is posing relates to the fact that first, this person who's got life, and it's also how you understand life, is completely absent in this thinking, and is just considered, you know, as an accessory. So what about this person, you know?
Yeah, but that is, I don't know if my explanation, maybe my explanation is insufficient, right? Maybe my explanation is insufficient. I don't think my presentation at least presented this person as invisible, because I wanted to determine the status of this thing carried, and I'm calling it a thing because I don't want to beg the question by assuming that it already has value, right? But at least now my talk has suggested that this thing has a potential. Right? This thing has got a potential. And then the question, I think the pressing question that I'm asking is this: is the choice of the actual person so powerful that it overrules the potential of this thing? That, I think that's where the real debate is. That's where the real debate is. But for us to settle that debate, I'm saying there are different ways to do it. One way to do it is to take a moral model that says autonomy is the most important thing in the world. If you say autonomy is the most important thing in the world, then it seems the actual person counts more than anything, right? But I'm saying I am not going with the autonomy model, at least the liberal model of autonomy that says that the subject as something removed from everything is the only concern. I'm saying there are other ways to think about autonomy. And I'm saying if you're drawing from the feminist literature, you're even standing in a position very close to mine, because you've got a different conception of autonomy, the relational conception of autonomy, right? Which recognizes this kind of a relationship, right? Which recognizes the responsibility to grow this potential, right? I mean, the position of the fetus is very close to the position of the infant, right? The infant also, the difference that it's outside now of the mother, but the dependency still continues, right? For this child to develop to become a normal functioning human being requires to depend on these mothering relationships. Right? The question can still be posed analogically to say, but why must I leave my autonomy to focus on my life and focus on this? Why can't I just abandon them, right? And but say, and what will be the basis for saying that, right? And I think the key question comes from exactly to say, how are we thinking about how things come to a value? If things come to a value because of reason, it's obvious that an infant does not have reason, right? It's obvious, right? It's obvious that an infant does not have autonomy. At the very least, got the potential for it. So the analogy, the correlation between an infant and the fetus is very close, and often implications of one have got implication for another. And from feminist perspective, this is very serious if you think about it. If feminist ethics uses the mother-child relationship to think about morality, it's a relationship of dependency, and dependency is the one through which you are able to empower, to care, to help the other to realize their personhood. Those are relationships that are meant to facilitate the attainment of subjecthood and humanity. And the question that I think, if you think about this from African thought, that is pushing is, why are we not pushing this relationship further backwards? That I think that's where I'm pushing, right? And I'm saying if you are insisting on autonomy, the consequences of the liberal conception of autonomy puts the infant and the child at risk. Because also there's this dependency, except that now it's not direct that you're inside, but you're outside. But you're also a being of potentiality. You still don't have the capacity. I'm saying put in that position, you're in a similar position as a fetus. And I'm saying theoretically, as a philosopher, we need to find a unified account that protects not only if you reject the fetus, then you must have a theory to accommodate the infant. And I'm saying often people think they can get away with this one and still want to keep this one. I'm saying it's not that simple. You need a theory that can unify, that can explain why, what is the distinction here. And I'm saying this operates on the zone of potentiality.
All right, so I'm unfortunately going to have to end it there for the interest of time, because we were meant to end about 15 minutes ago. But thank you everyone for all your contributions, and thank you to Dr. Molefe for a very thought-provoking conversation. I hope that it will inspire a bit more debate, especially in these very, topical issues. And also, I think it's important to really think about the implications of the ethical backgrounds that we hold. And I think that's what has been invited today. So thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Sure.